At the very end of our last recording, we had been talking about the emergentist explanation for language learning. However, I have since remembered that our text actually uses the term interactionist to describe something very similar in terms of bridging the gap between our two other types of language learning. So I wanted to start this recording actually introducing more detail on the interactionist explanation rather than where we had left off, because this is going to line up more with what we have in our textbook. So that's where we're going to pick up with this one.
And as promised, it's all about that interaction between the innate biological components and our external environmental components. And we've kind of settled at a point where, yeah, there must be some kind of internal innate component, because we've talked about the fact that we have all of these universal patterns. We have our universal gestures, universal grammar. We start seeing lots and lots of consistency in terms of sounds and rules and applications of rules, and even the types of errors that get made. And that type of consistency tells us, yeah, there has to be something innate and biological here. But we also have a bunch of evidence that says there is an effect of your external environment, where the stuff that you're exposed to and how you're exposed to it also can facilitate or impede your language acquisition. So we're now saying that there is this social experience, and it interacts with our innate biological language abilities to produce our language acquisition process. So this is bridging that gap between our nativist approaches and the environmentalist or behaviorist approaches. So we want to consider both nature and nurture, once again, as per always. So we know that parents are going to be tailoring their verbal interactions with their children. So by simplifying the way that you talk to children, you can sort of facilitate that language acquisition process. So we tend to talk slower, we talk more clearly and more simply. I even find that some of this creeps into how I teach. If I'm teaching a concept that I know is really challenging, it's something that people tend to struggle with, you'll actually find I slow down. I tend to find myself talking more quickly if I get excited about something. But if I'm like, this is important, I'm going to slow down, I'm going to enunciate, and I'm also going to repeat myself. So I'm helping facilitate learning, and we do exactly the same when we're interacting with children, especially if we know that we're talking, say, about something they might not have the words for. So we tend to simplify to try and match their level of understanding. We've also given those examples of if you don't have exposure, we find that we don't acquire language, so the exposure itself is really important. But all of this is just going to be a combination of all of the bits of evidence that we had for the behaviorist approach and all the evidence that we had for our innate approach. And both of them help support this theory because it really just stuck them all together. Now, very quickly, I just wanted to point to this diagram. We don't need to know a ton here, but this is more of a visual representation that says our development of language, our acquisition of language, is going to be influenced by biological factors, though we want to consider that it's not just sort of innate frameworks. It is also going to include things like the physical structures and connections in our brains. We know that as we get older, our brains make more and more connections, especially if we start looking at things like the number of neurons or the neural density within our brains. We actually have peak density not as adults, but when we're 2 years of age. And that seems so silly. Why would a 2-year-old have more neurons or more connections than an adult if we're making connections as we grow and learn? And the reason is that as part of our neural development, we actually just make extra connections. In order to make sure that we haven't missed anything, we overproduce neurons. And as time goes on through experience, we learn that a bunch of them are redundant and we start pruning them, we get rid of them. So this process of forming these extra connections can actually influence what we are and are not capable of learning. This also ties to things like there's something called childhood amnesia. Basically, most people can't remember anything before the age of, say, 4 or 5. There's some variation there. But one of the theories is the fact that our brains reorganize so dramatically that even if we stored information from that period in our life, it's been completely lost because the connections have changed. So that idea of this maturation of these cells, the migration of these cells as they're produced, the connections that they're forming, as well as the pruning that happens as they're being used, that whole developmental process can influence what we are capable of learning and not capable of learning. And that is going to influence our cognitive development, how we can think about things. And we'll even start talking about the fact that when it comes to sort of the way that we think about things, the way that we think about stuff can also influence the words that we use and how we use them. And there's even some theories about the fact that the words that we have to think about stuff can influence our perception. So that is up for debate. We also have our environment, specifically our linguistic environment, where if we're exposed to stuff, there's the potential to learn those words. But if there isn't exposure to that, you might not learn them. That's one of the reasons why we say, sort of as an adult, you're going to have a vocabulary between, say, 50 and 100,000 words. That's going to depend dramatically on stuff like, well, do you read? Do you watch TV that uses a variety of words? So exposure to stuff is going to influence what you do and don't learn. And so all of this is saying that our exposure to stuff can be influenced by our capabilities, and our biological components and developmental processes can influence all of it. So this is all just saying in a really dumb diagram, because they're all double-ended arrows, that we need to consider biological and developmental components. We need to consider internal cognitive type processes and the environment in which we're learning, and all of those influence language development. So whether the diagram is of any use is up to you, but the verbal component, the explanation that these are all important, that's the part we want to take from this slide. Now, the next little section here is going to lean a little bit closer into some neuroscience-y stuff, but only to the level that I'm going to show you pictures of brains and point to specific areas and talk about functions. We are not going deep here. We probably won't do tons of deep stuff in this class, but I will say that you are going to get very familiar with this figure. This is my favorite diagram of the brain, simply because it's very clear, that it's very high contrast, and I absolutely love that when it labels something, it also tells you what that area is associated with. It's weird that that's my favorite part, but that's my favorite part. I like having everything in one place. But we care about this one for a couple of reasons. The first I'll point out is the fact that it labels all of the different lobes of the brain. We're going to become familiar with these, so I figured I'd point them out here. But first off, we have our frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is at the front. So this is going to be the front of the brain. Our eyes would be sort of down here, our ears off on the side, and then this is the back of the brain. So we're orienting ourselves. We're kind of looking side on. So our frontal lobe is going to go sort of all of this orangey area plus this blue. This blue is special because that's where all of our motor control is. So we'll talk about our primary motor cortex at some point this semester, but that's just how we control our actions. So that point forward, and I like to think of it where you would wear over-ear headphones, that is the dividing point. Moving forward is going to be our frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe's at the front. I'm going to then drop down. So here on the sides, we have our temporal lobe. And I remember this one because our temples are on the sides and our temporal lobe is on the side too. Our brain exists as sort of mirrored halves. So we have two hemispheres and they look identical, more or less. So temporal lobe, we have one on each side. It's the same as the frontal lobe. You technically have one on each side. So the temporal lobe on the side, frontal lobe's the front. At the very back, occipital lobe, so that's going to be at the base of your skull. So in that case, the occipital lobe is actually related to vision, which is weird because our eyes are on the front, but we actually perceive visual stuff in the back. And I remember that one because anything that starts with that occipit component is usually talking about seeing or eyes or something like that. And why have I left the last one up here, this sort of purple, including this green component for last? And that's because there are 4 lobes and I have something sort of quirky to remember the other 3. So I just know that the parietal lobe is what's left. So occipital lobe for vision, frontal at the front, temporal at the temples, and our parietal lobe is the stuff remaining. So the green part is just like when we talked about the blue being our special motor cortex. The green is special because that's where we perceive body senses. So if something touches you, it's going to activate that somatosensory cortex. So that is where sensations from touch senses are going to go. And the rest of the parietal lobe sort of moving backwards. So it starts where that headphone was sitting, moving back. It's going to go until it hits the occipital lobe. So all of this just gives us a little bit of orientation. And then the parts that we care about, and you're probably figuring this out already, is going to be Broca's area, because that's labeled for speech formation, and Wernicke's area here, which is labeled for speech understanding. And because now we know where all of these lobes are, we know our dividing boundaries, we know that Wernicke's area is going to be in our temporal lobe, and Broca's area is going to be in our frontal lobe. And we're actually going to look at the fact that incoming auditory information, so hearing, is going to be in our temporal lobes. So we hear something, Wernicke's area helps us understand it. Once we understand it, we're going to formulate our own responses so that information moves forward. Broca's area is where we decide what we're going to say, and we decide what movements need to happen for us to say it. And then it sends that signal to our primary motor cortex, where we actually produce those movements to make those sounds. So we by now should probably have figured out that Broca's area being located in that frontal lobe, it's our left frontal lobe and typically lower left frontal lobe. So on here, we don't get those same divisions, but if we kind of remember, there's that vertical divide. We actually have this deep crevice right about where our headphones would sit. And that's always what I use as my indicator between the frontal lobe in front and our parietal lobe behind. And then off on the side, we have another one of those deep crevices, but this time it's a horizontal crevice or crease. And that tells us that this portion down here is going to be that temporal lobe, just orienting ourselves. So we're still looking at the same thing. We've just taken off some of those overlays. So now we're just seeing Broca's area. And depending on the diagram you're looking at and how precise it's getting, it might sort of cover slightly different areas. We just care in general that it's in that lower left frontal lobe. So individuals who have damage to that area are at greater risk of having problems with producing speech. So the first thing we need to know is the concept of an aphasia. And aphasia is an inability or difficulty in either producing or comprehending language. Now, this is typically going to be used in terms of either Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia, hence us talking about Broca's and Wernicke's areas. So with Broca's aphasia, it's based on a scientist named Broca. So here it's not named after the person, it's named after the researcher who observed it first. And he had a patient, and the patient is sort of codenamed Tan. So just like when we talk about, say, HM or KF as some of our case studies, usually they have some kind of name or tag associated that isn't necessarily related to their original names. Though, of course, some of them we do know. So HM being Henry Molaison, that came out later on. But here, this patient was called Tan because after head trauma to this part of their head, sort of that lower frontal left side of their head, they ended up only able to produce a single word, tan. And so in this case, even if they tried to say anything else, they were incapable of producing any kind of sort of words that made sense or even words that were words. It was mostly just attempts at sounds and nothing was really coming out properly. This is called Broca's aphasia, and since we talk about Broca's area in terms of ability to produce sound, Broca's aphasia is that inability to produce language. So you can't produce words. In contrast with Wernicke's area, so that's a little bit further back. And if we remember what I had mentioned last time, so within that temporal lobe, towards this upper portion, sort of right at that intersection between the top of our temporal lobe and where that parietal and frontal lobes, all of this sort of intersecting here, that's where our primary auditory cortex is. So that's where we're able to bring in sounds and start interpreting them. And the further you get from that initial projection site, the more complicated the functions are. So when we're perceiving sound to begin with, we're, say, recognizing individual frequencies, but eventually we're going to say, oh, these combinations of frequencies or these variations in tone are telling us something. So as we get further out, Wernicke's area is going to be one of our auditory association areas, or at least adjacent to those, and it's going to allow us to take the sounds that we're hearing and associate them with meaning. So this is all about language comprehension, so understanding what's being said to us. And like we've said before, we're going to have this bridge between the two where we hear something, so that auditory area, we understand it, and then we're going to produce a response. Actually, okay, before I move on, because I don't think I finished saying the words on this slide. I got too excited about talking about that flow of information like I did last time. But this is, like we said, Wernicke's aphasia, so the inability to comprehend language that's being produced. This is also sometimes called fluent aphasia, because if the damage is just to that left temporal lobe, then we don't actually lack the ability to produce those words. Broca's area is still fine, and all the motor areas associated. So in this case, the problem comes in with that comprehension, that meaning associated with all those words. So in this case, you'd find that somebody is maybe producing words that don't actually link together. And of course, there are medical shows that have done this. I am thinking of a House episode where they're trying to figure out why this guy is speaking nonsense. He's saying actual words, but not in any way that makes sense. So in this case, it's fluent aphasia because you are still able to talk, but you've lost that meaning behind those words. And then, of course, that's where we talk about that flow. So we said before, our auditory areas, so primary auditory cortex is going to be right around here. We're going to have our orientations again. So that's our division for the temporal lobe. This vertical crevice here is going to be that distinction between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And we're going to see that that information comes into our auditory cortex. Comprehension comes through Wernicke's area. We have this accurate, accruate, yes, there we go, fasciculus. Oh my goodness, it's apparently too early in the day for this. But this word is that bridge between the two areas. So it's going to pass through that area, hit Broca's area, where we're deciding what it is that we'd like to say in response. So we need that meaning from what we've heard, and then we need meaning associated with the sounds we want to produce too, because we would like to respond in a way that makes sense considering what's going on around us. And then, like we said before, this particular bump on our brains is going to correlate with this blue bump in here, and that's going to be that primary motor cortex. So that's going to be how we're producing our response when we decide exactly what it is we want to say. So that's going to help with things like moving your lips the right way, controlling how much air you're letting pass through your vocal cords, how tight your vocal cords are, and so on and so forth. And this is something highly controlled, so there's actually a very large component of that motor cortex that's devoted to things that help us speak. So we actually have an overrepresentation for the muscles in our lips and our tongues and our throats in order to highly control the sounds that we produce. And if you start looking cross species, even other primates don't have this same kind of specialization. It's actually one of the reasons why, even in studies trying to teach language to other primates, they tend to do very poorly and often rely on gestural communication because they're not capable of producing the same array of sounds that we are. So, something to note. All right. So, what's our big take home from this? Looking at our two case studies, we have Wernicke's patient, we have Broca's patient. They're showing us that damage in these two distinctive areas can actually interfere with our ability to produce meaningful speech, but they're interfering at different places and at different levels. So one with comprehension and one with production. So we can say, all right, there seems to be an area of the brain that's involved in speech production. There's an area specifically involved in comprehension, and both of those areas seem to be in our left hemisphere. So we keep talking about that left hemisphere. And you might remember the term from other places of hemispheric lateralization. And all that means is that we are lateralizing or pushing stuff to one side or the other. And this is something that humans do for a whole bunch of different things. The easiest to think of is handedness. If you are right-handed or left-handed, you are showing lateralization in your fine motor control. And this is fairly common. It's one of the reasons why the vast majority of the population tends to be right-handed. That hemisphere tends to specialize in sort of those fine motor controls. And if we don't need as much control in the opposite hand, then we can free up space for other tasks. We also have ocular dominance. One eye is relied on a lot more heavily than the other, so we tend to maybe assign less importance to the other, less resources to the other. So this is something that you can see if you stare at your finger with both eyes open and then close one eye and then close the other to see if your finger moves. When you close one eye, your finger doesn't move much at all, which means that you've just closed your non-dominant eye. But if you find there's a really big hop where your finger seems like it's shifted to one side or the other, it means you've just closed your dominant eye and your brain had to switch to using the information from your non-dominant eye. So this is something that happens all the time in a bunch of different ways, and language is another one of those. So our language centers tend to be centralized to the left, though there are, of course, variations. And I am just going to quick check. I don't have a slide for it, so I can just say it. This is something where there's lots of individual variation. I already mentioned handedness, where right-handed individuals, we actually have our left hemisphere controlling our right hands. I guess everyone has that. But for right-handed individuals, that area in the left hemisphere is very large. For left-handed individuals, your left hand is controlled by your right hemisphere. Everything crosses over in the brain, which may or may not come up later in the term. But it means that then you have extra stuff devoted in that hemisphere to controlling the opposite hand. And there's some weirdness with handedness where because most of our studies are done on right-handed individuals, that's where we have most of our knowledge. And even if you start looking at, say, fMRI studies, oftentimes they actually exclude left-handed individuals. And the reason for this is if you are left-handed, you are less likely to have that typical orientation, that typical lateralization for your brain. So you'd be less likely to have your language centered in your left hemisphere. It would either be shared between hemispheres or could even be in your right hemisphere. But again, there's lots and lots of variation here. So some left-handed people do still have it in the left hemisphere. It just depends. But of course, as researchers, when there's that potential for variation that's going to sort of muck up our data, we would rather just exclude those individuals and focus on consistency. So all of this is reported as on average. And I can even say within right-handed individuals, you will still find variation, even to the point of there being sex differences, where women tend to be less lateralized than men, which means that we share language functions across hemispheres. It's one of the reasons why they think that women tend to have better recovery rates of language production after strokes that affect their language areas, because the other side is already doing some of that. But that is a whole can of worms that we don't need to get into. So all of that out of the way, if we're just going back to language stuff in the left hemisphere, what about the right hemisphere? This is somewhere where our understanding is starting to grow and expand as we're able to do more and more of our less invasive studies, things like fMRI or functional MRI, where you can watch where the blood is flowing throughout the brain. So we're starting to get evidence that our right hemisphere seems to help us with language processing and more of that language comprehension. So it might be that rather than Wernicke's area running everything, it's where all of our knowledge of what words mean is stored. It's probably more of a control center where maybe that information on what different words mean is stored maybe throughout our cortex, throughout the outer surface of our brain, and Wernicke's area is just where it's linked back to whatever sounds it is that we've just heard. So it might be more of a broadly reaching process that's actually recruiting multiple other areas and even areas on the other side of the brain. So it's not just the left hemisphere, though typically when you boil it down, people talk about language in the left, which makes it pretty easy to remember. We do find, though, that if we're, say, getting people to perform language tasks, typically while in an MRI or while doing an EEG study, so if we have electrodes recording electrical activity in the surface, we'll often be able to see electrical activity in the right hemisphere, even when doing language tasks, but especially when we're doing language tasks that require you to have some kind of understanding of the meaning behind the words. You can control for stuff like this by using nonsense words where there is no meaning, but that's sort of its own thing. We do find that damage to the right hemisphere can still cause subtle language comprehension problems, not so much in the production, but definitely in the comprehension side of things. Though this might depend on the individual who is injured, because usually when we're looking at brain injuries, we're typically stuck with our case studies. So this is something where someone happens to be injured and we happen to get their agreement to study them. They might also still have some of their language on both sides. So we'll take that with a grain of salt. We already talked neuroimaging studies showing evidence of right hemispheric activation. That's all good. We do also find that children, so in extreme cases, you might have individuals where from a young age would have one of their hemispheres removed. This seems really extreme, but there are extreme cases where, say, there's uncontrollable electrical activity, where uncontrolled seizures can actually be fatal, especially when you're very young. And there have been successful cases where they've removed the problematic hemisphere to preserve as much tissue as possible. And even if that's the left hemisphere that's removed, we still find that these individuals are typically able to acquire almost normal language functioning. This is a lot better in terms of sort of outcome if it's done younger. And this ties to the idea that our brains are very plastic, meaning there's a lot of potential for adjustment, a lot of potential for compensation. And we have more potential for compensation when young. So this says, well, there is the ability for that side of the brain to take over language functioning, and it's very likely to do it starting younger. So it's not out of sort of the realm of possibility for that hemisphere to still be involved. And once again, the fact that some individuals will have their language functioning shared across hemispheres could even be another piece of evidence towards the fact that our right hemisphere seems to be involved. So interesting to note. And as the time goes on, I'm sure we'll get more and more information about this, but we're still very much at sort of the cutting edge of our understanding. And then very, very briefly, I've mentioned bilingualism or multilingualism before, that idea of language learning and learning second languages, where those languages seem to be stored and how we use them seems to depend quite a lot on when we learn them. So we'll find that earlier learning means that they tend to be stored in the same areas as your primary language, whereas later learning often ends up recruiting other areas of the brain, meaning that it probably wasn't within that sensitive period we've mentioned before and was more likely outside of that and therefore had to be learned in a slightly different way. Now, especially in a country like Canada, where they've really tried to have that sort of bilingualism embedded in, say, schools, where you're required to take French from a certain age, depending on where you live, there's, of course, been tons and tons of studies into the effects of bilingualism. And one of the big things is early studies ended up showing that the children who were bilingual showed less sort of cognitive advancements than those who were monolingual. Basically, they were pointing at it and saying, well, they have smaller vocabularies, their processing is slower, all of these things. And everyone looked at it and said, okay, well, we should use this to push to stop having these other language lessons. However, when later studies were conducted and controls were taken and everything was sort of balanced out properly, they actually found that either there's no difference between bilingual versus monolingual, or knowing multiple languages is actually a boost to cognitive abilities. So it really depends. And usually it's going to be a matter of a trade-off. So one of the studies I'm thinking of, they basically looked at that vocabulary size. And they said, yes, bilingual children will have a smaller vocabulary in any one language, but it's because they've split their focus across 2 or more languages. If you actually look at their cumulative number of words that they know across all languages, it's going to be on par or even higher than those children who only speak one language. And you'll actually find follow-up studies that look at things like, say, cognitive flexibility, where individuals speaking multiple languages often show better control, a better ability to, say, inhibit incorrect responses, which might actually come from spending your life practicing to say things in one language but not the other, even though both languages are stored together. So all sorts of really cool research in this area, but as per usual, we kind of have to cut it short just because of constraints for time. But yeah, interesting to note, and since we had talked about it, I figured I'd include it. Now, the next little bit, I think we have two more broad sections here, and they're kind of lumped under the function of language as well as problem solving. But this is mainly just a discussion of how do we link language to the way that we think, and then focusing in on thinking, we can look at some of our logical processes, and specifically how we think about different types of problems, as well as some of the biases that exist within human thought. So very optimistic and a lot talked about very, very quickly. So the first thing, that link between language and thought, is of course the linguistic relativity hypothesis, or you might know this as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Now, this is another one of those fairly controversial things, and depending on the year and who you ask, there seems to be support for it and then evidence against it, and people aren't quite sure where it stands. So let's talk about it and some of those concerns. So this is actually a fairly old hypothesis, so the early 1900s, and Whorf said that our language has the ability to shape the nature of how we think. And because it shapes how we think, it then also shapes our perception of the environment around us. So, in a roundabout way, language actually controls how we interpret our environment because it controls how we can think about our environment. And therefore, our thought influences our reality. So, a pretty intensive theory to propose. So, if I want sort of more specific detail with the definition on the slide, we're saying our structural differences in language can actually alter one's perception and understanding of the reality of the world around them. So again, pretty intense to claim. So in this case, they're saying things like, actually I can use this example here. So they looked at a bunch of different languages where different languages will have different words for different colors. And most languages tend not to divide or color words up the same way across all of them. In fact, you can run into some places where, of course, I always forget to write down the language. There's one language that has two color words, one for warm colors and one for cool colors. Whereas the example from here, I believe this was looking at English speakers versus Russian speakers, where in English we have tons of words for blue. You just have to look at, say, a box of Crayola crayons and all the different colors they talk about in their range of blues. So you can talk cerulean or sapphire or whatever else. So we have lots and lots of color words. But when they were looking at the Russian language, they have words for light blue versus dark blue. And that's sort of their distinction. In this case, we're saying, all right, well, does that difference in the words that we use to describe a color affect our ability to discriminate between colors? The idea being, if you use fewer color words, you are therefore perceiving fewer distinctive colors in your environment, and therefore would perform really poorly if you have to tell the difference between fairly similar hues. So here, they'd be presented with a sample color, anywhere between 1 and 20 on this scale, and then they would give you two comparison colors, one that matches and one that's just a little bit off. And they would anticipate the accuracy would vary depending on the language that you speak. Now, this has been done in a bunch of different ways with a bunch of different colors and a ton of different languages, and there is some research that casts some doubt on this. Of course, because the theory was originally proposed and accepted, there was some initial evidence that says, yeah, this seems to be what's happening. They've also done some studies where they're like, well, we don't actually find as large of an effect as we thought we should. And then we get into some questions. And one of my favorites to think about here is a matter not so much of physical ability to perceive, because humans are going to have the same rods and cones. Our perception in terms of color should be fairly similar. There are variations. Color blindness, you could be a dichromat missing out on one of our cones, or you could be a quadchromat. I think that's what that one is, where you have an extra cone, which is fairly rare but not uncommon. But for the most part, we're going to see similarly. Now, the way that I think about it is in terms of experience. So, as a kid, I've mentioned before, I did art before I decided that I was going into academia. So, I applied to an art college. So, I did lots of coloring and painting and stuff like that. So, you have lots and lots of experience with colors. But I had friends who were not artists. They just, didn't do anything with visual graphics. And when looking at different things, I might be more drawn to color than they were. But also, if you were doing something like one of those images that circulates and they say, how many different colors can you see? How many different blocks are present? Different people will have different guesses. And I would usually be on the higher end of guesses. Some other people might be lower than that. So maybe it's not so much a matter of you can or can't perceive, but maybe you've practiced noticing the difference between particular hues. And if we want to tie that back to language and why we might actually see a difference between languages, think about a kindergarten class. So I'm going to hold up a card and I'm going to ask you, actually, I had an example here. So I hold up a card and I ask you, what color is this? Well, if you have more color words, you're going to be given more categories to try and label things. So I show you an apple and you tell me it's red. I show you a leaf and you tell me it's green. Well, if you don't have a word for green, well, you just skip that. It gets lumped into some other category. So the more words you have, the more categories you practice with, and that might influence some of our results. So that's where we get into why some people would say that Worf was maybe half right about these claims, because language is playing a role, but it's more than just the fact that language changes how you see things. It's more about how you categorize things. So his original theory was probably a little bit overly simplistic, but also overly grandiose, a little bit bigger than it should have been. So we can say that maybe language influences thoughts by highlighting specific properties, specific categories for those particular concepts. So it can influence what we pay attention to, but it isn't necessarily limiting what we can and can't perceive. And that might be a small distinction to some people. They might say, okay, that sounds all well and good, but it still means that different languages are going to respond differently. So it's the same thing, and that's totally fine. We just sort of want to acknowledge what else might be going on and then move on from there. And of course, if we're talking about putting these different colors or items that have specific colors into particular categories, we can actually start talking about categories and concepts. And this is something that I've already sort of accidentally laid the groundwork for, because I used my example when we were talking methods of my chickadee experiment. And of course, you'll get tired of this, but it's kind of nice to use the same example over and over again because it illustrates a bunch of points. But in that study, we're asking the birds to learn that male calls are good and female calls are bad. So if they learn that, if they learn that all male calls should produce a particular response, they have learned the concept of male calls. And if they learn that all the female calls should have a different response, we're also seeing that that's treated as a separate concept or a separate category. So usually we'll talk about being able to sort of generalize. You can react the same way when you're looking within a particular category. So you react the same way to all male calls, but you also are going to discriminate or tell the difference between different categories. So they treat male calls differently than female calls. So that's something that's actually used fairly commonly in psychological research, just to understand how we think about things. So if we want a specific definition here, when we're talking about concepts, we're talking about sort of abstract mental representations that sort of group or categorize or groups or categories are going to share, or Make sure I say that right. There's a bunch of different words here. If I'm just going to say it in my own words, we'll say that we're grouping things together. We are categorizing them based on shared features. It's probably a better way to say it. I think I've conjugated something wrong here. But maybe we're looking at related objects, related events, or some other kind of stimulus, and stimulus here being our catch-all term. But my chickadee calls can count here. So we're grouping them based on what they were produced by. So sex, male versus female. They form their own separate different categories based on sort of our mental representation of them. So we can group things based on the concept that makes that up. And we're going to have a bunch of different rules that are going to determine which category or which concept it is we're looking at. So our rules for concepts are going to specify things that are necessary and things that are sufficient for us to determine membership in a particular category. So we might have things that are sort of a necessary condition, basically says that something must be true of our object or our stimulus or our event for it to belong to that category. So if we were, say, looking at snakes, for something to be a snake, it can't have legs. As soon as we have those vestigial legs, it falls into a different category. So our concept for understanding what snakes are, a necessary condition would be that they can't have legs. So that would be one way of saying it. It doesn't mean that absolutely everything that doesn't have legs is going to be a snake, but it tells us that for something to be a snake, it can't have those legs. We also need a sufficient condition, or sometimes can have a sufficient condition, I guess. And this is something that, if it's true of the object, it's going to prove that it belongs to that category. So in this case, we couldn't call that lack of legs a sufficient condition because things like worms exist. So we'd need to come up with something else. And we might not be able to come up with something that says this automatically falls into this particular category. So I didn't write myself an example, which is unfortunate. I assumed I'd come up with one really quick. Okay, maybe if we say someone is taking classes at a institution of some kind, that would be sufficient for us to label them as a student. So as long as you are taking those classes at an educational place, that would tell us that you are a student. There might be other sort of categories or other categories you fit into or other concepts that might apply, but we for sure know that you have membership within that category of a student. That's probably not a terrible example. And then I have a bunch of visuals here, which will help us actually follow through with a bunch of these really quickly. I will say that the fact that almost all of these involve birds was not actually my choosing. These came from a bunch of different textbooks, and it seems every textbook uses birds as an example, and I just rolled with it. So in these cases, we're looking at our concept of bird, and we can have different features that are going to be sort of helping us understand that this is stuff that's typical of birds. And then we're going to have things where we know that not everything fits perfectly into a category. So a fantastic example here is, okay, has feathers, can fly, has wings. Those are defining features of birds. So that's stuff that's most often true. Not always, but most often. So in this case, if we look at a robin is actually fairly close to a prototype member of this group. And we'll see the definition for that in a moment. But basically, it's going to be pretty species typical or pretty category typical. So a robin is going to have wings. It can fly. It has feathers. It picks off a lot of those characteristics that come to mind when we think of the concept of a bird. We also have some other things, some characteristic features of that specific organism. So here we know that robins are red-breasted. They also move in little hops, and they tend to be fairly small. So those are all things that aren't necessarily required for us to call it a bird, but this particular bird also has some of these characteristics. Now, if we look at a less typical bird, we can have an ostrich. So they're going to have feathers, but they can't fly. They do have wings though, so they've got 2 out of 3. And we do know that they are still birds, so they fall in this category, but it's a much weaker connection because they don't pick as many of those sort of defining features. Same thing if we looked at, say, penguins. Penguins are also not able to fly. So they're going to have that weak connection because they don't have all the characteristics that we would use in defining this particular category. So we can start considering these things, sort of what sorts of traits are present. And a different example, actually from our textbook, we have sort of our generic prototype bird, which looks an awful lot like a robin, which kind of illustrates my point. We also have wrens, which are pretty typical of birds as well. So they're going to fly, they're going to sing, they're going to lay eggs, they're small, they nest in trees. But then we have our blue herons, which aren't going to hit all of those. They are not small, they don't nest in trees, though some species of herons will. We get into eagles. Eagles don't sing, they're not songbirds, but they tick off some of the other stuff. And here we have penguins as one of our outliers. We could put our ostriches as outliers too. But all of these are just saying that we have specific properties or characteristics that help us determine if something should fall into a particular category. And the more of those you have, the stronger your category membership. So let's actually get some of our terms here. So there are two main theories that are going to try and explain how we decide if something belongs to a category or not. Now, both of these can kind of work for how we've been talking about it so far, but we're going to talk prototype theory and we're going to talk exemplar theory. So I've already been using the term prototype to talk about sort of our most typical member of a particular category. But the exemplars are actually going to be using experience as well. But I do have slides for each of these, but I'm going to read the definitions because I don't know that they're on the next slide. But prototype theory says we're looking at new objects and we're going to classify them by comparing them to some best or most typical member, our prototype, for that particular category. So our robin or our stereotypical bird from the previous examples could be our prototype for our concept of what a bird is. Our exemplar theory says that we're going to make those category judgments. We're going to decide if something belongs to a group or not by looking at sort of this new instance in comparison with some of our stored memories of other stuff that has belonged to this category before. So with our prototype theory, we're saying that we have our most common or typical form, and we're going to say, as soon as we think of this word or this concept, this is how we imagine it. So our stereotypical bird, our robin, would be kind of what you think of when you think birds. Here's an example from one of my other texts that says, all right, here's our prototype member. So we have these things, and these things are circular, blue, and they have little squiggles. Now, if we have new instances, we have these new members, and we have to decide, do they fit within this group? So our triangle, it's gray. It's a triangle, not a circle, and it has no squiggly bit. So I'd say for sure that doesn't belong. It doesn't share any features, so I'm pretty confident saying the triangle is out. Then we have our blue circle. So it's missing the squiggly bits, but it's blue and circular. So I'm saying 2 out of 3 isn't bad. That's probably part of this category. Well, what about our rectangle at the bottom? It's green, but it has squiggly bits, but it's not a circle. 1 out of 3, do we still put it in that category? And same thing with our triangle up here. It's the same color, but it's a different shape and it doesn't have our squiggles. So maybe that's enough or maybe it's not, depending on this case. So here we'd make some determinations. We'd be pretty confident with this one being in the group, pretty confident with this one being out of the group, and then these ones are somewhere in the middle. So maybe that weak association. Now for our exemplar theory, so here an exemplar is going to be a thing that serves as a good example of a category member. Or in the case of exemplar theory, we're looking at a collection of things that we know from experience have fallen within this category and are therefore a great example of what actually counts as being within this category. And so here I managed to sneak in some of my own pictures. So a pigeon, my bird at home, so a parrot. We have a raven over here. And then what about this guy? I think this is a nutcracker. So one of the Clark's nutcrackers, maybe, or a gray jay. I can never remember. But we have this new guy, and we're saying, okay, he doesn't quite look exactly like any of these. They all have slightly different shapes, different colorings, but It does have the same kind of body as this guy, maybe a longer beak like this one. The feet look kind of sharp and pointy, maybe like this one. So we'd say, yeah, this probably counts as a bird too, because it looks an awful lot like some of the characteristics that these exemplars have. So in both cases, we're really just comparing to some kind of example. But in our prototype case, we have sort of one general idea of what a typical bird looks like. And in the other, we say we know these things are birds, so this new thing likely falls within this category too. And just in case you want another example, and it's not a bird example, one of the texts uses dogs, where we'd say, all right, we have a new dog that you've encountered. If we're going prototype theory, we would say this is our internal representation of a stereotypical dog. Does it match that? Yes or no? Yeah, it's close enough. They have similar posture, both have ears, the tongues are out. Yeah, they look doggish. That would count. For the exemplar theory, we'd say, here are all of my exemplars of dogs, things that I have called dogs before successfully, and this looks like a couple of those, so we'd say, yeah, it matches and should belong to this particular category. And of course, if we have two different theories, we always ask, well, which one is involved? It's going to be a little bit of both. So we tend to compare to sort of a concept of whatever that thing is, but we also can rely on what we've seen in terms of experience. And of course, you can think of it as, well, with the more experience you have, maybe the more things you have to compare it to. If I very easily just know that I'm looking at something that's maybe a funky colored pigeon, well, it's exactly a pigeon, but the color is wrong, I can rely on other pigeons I've seen. I know that there's lots of variation there, so I'm not surprised that this is still a pigeon. It's still within that bird category. So my experience would be maybe more reliable in that case. But if you don't have tons of exemplars to compare against, you might be stuck with more of a prototype reliance, but it completely depends. And of course, if we look at some of those neuroimaging techniques, we have some of our studies that will do brain scans to look at activation in different places. They typically find that we're going to use both of these techniques when we are both forming concepts and categories as well as using those concepts and categories. So our left hemisphere and especially our visual cortex would be involved when we're forming prototypes. That visual cortex in our occipital lobe is going to be where we're interpreting our visual information. So it starts just like with our auditory cortex for our incoming auditory information. We process it sort of in that primary cortex, and as we get further away, we make more associations. With our visual cortex, it's exactly the same. We start with our primary visual cortex, and the information will spread outward and will make more and more determinations. So we start doing things like recognizing different shapes and different colors and different patterns and things like that. And then we get even further away and we start linking up with other concepts we've already stored and other things in other places. So all of that is sort of making sense. We also know that our right hemisphere is going to play a role, especially in recognizing those exemplars. So once we've stored information, maybe we're going to be thinking of, well, what do I think of when I think of this concept? Which we had actually already talked about in terms of our language processing, where when we start associating meaning, we might store that elsewhere throughout the brain, and this might be something fairly similar. So that right hemisphere is going to be involved. We do also see our prefrontal cortex being involved and our basal ganglia. We can talk about the prefrontal cortex because typically anytime we're doing a task that requires us to say pull information out of storage from memory, or if we're holding on to things to compare them, so anything with working memory, that tends to involve our prefrontal cortex. That's often where we're considering the stuff that we are currently consciously aware of. So you'll see activation in that area. If I tell you to say, imagine what this thing looks like, you're going to activate possibly that visual area, maybe, but for sure that prefrontal cortex, because that's where you're holding that image as you visualize it. So what does that possibly look like? we can start seeing things here. So we have some, so this is misleading because we're looking at the brain from the bottom, so instead of from the back. And it seems weird because they're labeling this as visual cortex. But if we're thinking about it, the back is where we keep pointing to for that primary visual area. That's because these would be more of visual associations, so stuff that's started to move forward, so we can start processing it. Just pointing that out because if you know about brain anatomy, this is like initially going to be a flag of that seems weird or wrong. And it's just because it should be a visual association area. That's when we're getting into some of our associations and some of the pathways that connect to other places. So if that matters to you, great. If not, ignore it. It's just visual related processing. We start seeing sort of, so here we're looking at animals versus tools, just to show that we have sort of distinctive activations. I will also make a note, though, that we may or may not have it mentioned in the text, but it's useful to know. There are different parts of the brain that seem to consistently light up for different categories of things. So specifically, we're going to have an area called the fusiform face area, and that's going to be where we recognize faces. So this part of our brain lights up consistently whenever we see a human face. And it doesn't have to be a familiar human face. It can just be anything, even vaguely human. We'll still get a little bit of activation if we say see other primates. We'll actually see vague activation if we had a circle with two dots around where the eyes should be. So this part of the brain preferentially responds to faces. We also have a part of the brain that preferentially responds to hands in different grasping positions. And that can relate to here when we're talking about tools. So tools are going to be grasped in particular ways, and we're going to then respond to them sort of in the same kind of areas of the brain. So there's going to be some patterns like that. And that's the whole purpose of having this slide here. It's not that I need you to memorize specific locations. It's more that it's illustrating that we can have these patterns where certain areas seem to be active consistently when we're interacting with or engaging with certain categories of objects, which is really, really neat. And of course, if you go into classes on, say, sensation and perception, you get to start talking about some other stuff that tends to activate, where even certain qualities possessed by objects can start activating consistent areas. So things like we'll recognize stuff as things that we can sit on. So chairs and benches would get lumped together with that particular area, which is just kind of neat.